Chapter 64 The Storm, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu was dreaming about playing on the swings at the temple when he woke suddenly to find that he had to clutch the bed frame to keep from being spilled onto the floor. He'd felt rough seas since boarding Antony's ship, but nothing like this. The room swooped and juddered around him, and as he stared blearily and tightened his instinctive grip on the bedposts, sleepy alarm rose into panic. It felt like the end of the world. What if they sank? Were they sinking already? Antony had said that the ship was packed full of wards and enchantments to protect it, but surely those had a limit. How could something be tossed and pitched about like this without being destroyed? Hanyu felt like he might be destroyed by all this chaos, and he had the solidly bolted bed frame to hold on to. The enormous ship that had blotted out the sky when it docked in the Taishan harbor suddenly seemed so tiny and fragile as he pictured it hurled over the waves. Where was Antony? As the first sob built in his chest, Hanyu couldn't help thinking that he wouldn't be nearly so frightened if Antony were there. That was foolish. What could Antony do about a storm? But surely after all these centuries on the sea, he was used to them, so he would be calm. He would scold Hanyu for his nerves in that half-hearted way he had, letting Hanyu know he wasn't really angry, and then he'd see his trembling and sigh and hold out an arm so Hanyu could cling to him while he anchored them against the bed, and it would be all right. This pleasant fantasy was ruined when another pitch knocked his head against the wall. The blow was hard enough to make his ears ring, and Hanyu curled into a tight ball around his queasy stomach and cried miserably as he clung even harder to the solid frame. It seemed like an eternity that he stayed like that, head full of the groans of the ship and the protesting creaks from all the furniture and leather holdfasts. He barely managed to keep from being sick all over himself. "Hanyu!" He barely registered the voice, but then something cold brushed his exposed neck, and he turned with a yelp to peek at the intruder. It was Antony, though he looked so different that it took Hanyu a moment to recognize him. The god had left disheveled, miles in his wake. He was a mess. His clothes were soaked through, his braid hung in sodden tatters, and his skin was so icy it barely felt like skin at all where it touched Hanyu. He was dripping where he stood. More than his appearance, though, his demeanor was what caught Hanyu off guard. His eyes were bright as new coins, and he was grinning. Antony? Grinning? Hanyu stared in mute disbelief until the god shook himself a little, sending a few freezing droplets to splatter on Hanyu's upturned face, and spoke. "Hell of a storm!" he cried, and even his voice was smiling and breathless, exhilarated in a way Hanyu had never heard it before. "I swear, one of those waves almost plucked me right off the riggings. Good thing I've got a strong grip, or I'd be gathering new specimens for Thad right now. I was worried about you, but I see you did just fine and held onto the bedposts. That's exactly right. You've got a good head on your— Ooh!" His cheery monologue cut off as Hanyu launched himself at his master's middle with a wail. As he released his hold on the bed frame and latched around Antony's waist, Hanyu realized that the rocking, though still present, had grown significantly calmer. The storm was subsiding, but Hanyu was more upset than he'd been during the worst of it. How could Antony talk like that? Almost swept into the ocean? That was awful! Hanyu felt sick and faint just from contemplating how awful it was. Why was his master being so damn jovial about it? Oh dear. Blessedly, Antony dropped his jaunty tone. Even more blessedly, his arms went around Hanyu's shoulders, drenching him but holding him close. "I didn't mean— Marcus and Theo were right there, and they'd never let anything happen to me. Felix could have grabbed me right out of the air without even looking up from his knots. I was never in any real danger." Hanyu was in no mood to be consoled. But what if they couldn't get you in time?" "Then I would have swum around until Theo managed to find me and haul me back on board for a hearty scolding. I can't drown, remember?" "But if the sun came up before she could—" Hanyu shuddered and felt his master's belly rise against his cheek in a sigh. "The point is that I wasn't washed off the ship, Hanyu. Why fuss about something that didn't happen? I'm sorry I brought it up at all. Really, though, this was hardly my first storm. I know what I'm doing." Hanyu's voice came out with an accusatory edge he hadn't intended. "You liked it!" "Well, all right, yes, a little." Antony's arms stayed locked around Hanyu, but he could hear the shrug in his god's tone nevertheless. "We don't get a lot of excitement or challenges. A little danger now and then does a person good, don't you think?" "No!" Hanyu had to admit to himself that usually he might have agreed, but at the moment he did not feel like being reasonable. Antony kept holding him. That's a funny sentiment, coming from a man who is so desperate to learn about all the far-off places he could explore that he broke into a murderous vampire's cabinet of horrors. There was so much warmth and fondness in the god's tone that Hanyu lifted his face, eyes burning both from his own tears and from the salt water drenching Antony's clothes, and met his gaze. His master's buoyancy had faded into a look of cheerful, teasing tenderness that he could have stared at forever. His alarm and anger relaxed their hold on his gut just a little. In the first place, I didn't break into anything, he said, almost unable to believe that he was joking about that awful day. It wasn't locked. In the second place, it was hardly a cabinet of horrors. Only because I hide my racy books so well. Antony smirked and relaxed his hold on Hanyu's shoulders. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to change into something dry. These are starting to chafe. Oh, of course. Hanyu released him, a little regretfully. That regret was eased when Antony immediately began wriggling out of his sodden clothes. Hanyu had sworn to stop thinking with his dick where his master was concerned, but he couldn't help admiring the lean strength of Antony's limbs, the softness of his belly, the jut of his bony hips, the intoxicating curve of his narrow ass, and the enticing shadow of his cock and balls in their nest of wiry hair. Every bit of his god's body was so lovely in isolation, but altogether, he was a song, a poem, complete and compact in his perfection. Antony turned to reach for his nightshirt, and Hanyu dropped his gaze just in time to avoid being caught staring. He tried to calm his racing heart, and even speedier fantasies as Antony shrugged into the long shirt and came towards him. Scoot over, I want to get under the covers, the god demanded, and Hanyu complied in a daze. Once Antony was settled, Hanyu waited a heartbeat longer, just enough to be sure that there would be no embarrassing poking or twitching for Antony to notice, then laid down himself and curled around the small, icy figure. Antony moaned, sounding so pleased and carnal that Hanyu had to quickly conjure an image of the high priest naked. You're so warm! Glad to help, was all Hanyu could manage in response. He needed a distraction, but despite his best efforts, the high priest's body kept shrinking into Antony, the skin darkening and sprouting a patchwork of scars. Scars! He seized desperately on the idea. Hey, Antony, he asked, proud that his voice came out only a few notes higher than usual. You said that your body is exactly the same as it was the night you turned into a god, right? I still say we're not gods, but yes, my body's the same. His master sounded weary, but Hanyu plunged ahead. So you got all those scars before then? He wasn't prepared for Antony's full-body flinch. The last of the god's cheery energy seemed to drain away, and he turned his head so Hanyu could no longer see his face. Ah, yes, Antony said to the wall. I apologize. I should have left the room to change. I know I'm an upsetting sight. What? How could he even think that? No, that's not what I meant. You're beautiful. Hanyu. The god's voice was patient but firm. I know you're kind-hearted, but you don't have to lie to me. I know how I look. After all, I've had a very long time to get used to it. You're right. I got these scars before we were cursed. Hanyu wanted to keep arguing about Antony's appearance. How could his master see himself as anything but stunning? Couldn't he see the way beauty lingered in every line and shadow of his body? Why did he think a few scars were enough to make him disgusting? True, there were rather a lot of them, but he was still more alluring than anyone else Hanyu had ever seen. Unfortunately, the god went on speaking before Hanyu had the chance to press the point. Some of them are just from the injuries you get as a child or from my weapons training, Antony said, squirming around again so that he could see Hanyu's face. But the big ones came from the night I went to rescue Valerius from the consort. Really? Hanyu cuddled closer, shelving the argument in favor of the story. Antony nodded. After he was kidnapped, I asked a few people, Claudia, Theo, Titus, Felix, and Julia, nobody else, for help. They only knew about him as my mother's gardener, but they realized what was going on between us before I'd said 3 sentences, and they all set to work trying to figure out where he'd been taken. Felix actually tailed the consort for a few days, which he could have been executed for if she'd noticed. I couldn't believe he would go so far for someone he'd barely met, but looking back, it actually doesn't surprise me. That's just how he is. Hanyu really did need to meet Lord Felix. The 6 of us shared constant messages with whatever scraps of information we'd gathered, so of course it was Claudia who ended up putting together all the pieces and figuring out his location. He was being held in a small manor house that belonged to one of the consort's friends, just outside the city. When Claudia sent us to the news, I took right off, even though she begged me to wait for the others. It was foolhardy of me, but I'm sure that won't surprise you. It did, actually. Hanyu found it hard to imagine Antony behaving rashly. Then again, he'd been a different person back then, quite literally. I tore my way through the first few goons easily enough and found the room where they were keeping him. He wasn't in good shape. I had to carry him, which I hadn't considered when I was planning my escape, insofar as I planned it all. One of the consort's hirelings happened upon us almost immediately and managed to stab me in the gut before I killed her. That's where the one over my navel came from. An image of the mangled flesh flashed through Hanyu's mind, making him wince at the recollection. Yes, he remembered that scar in particular. Even Hanyu had to admit that it was a gruesome one. Antony continued. We made it to the courtyard, but there was a wall, and with my wound, I couldn't heave him over. The remaining mercenaries started catching up with us, but I'd lost my sword, and it was too risky to use offensive magic while I was in that state, and Valerius was so vulnerable, so I just dropped him against the wall and covered him as best I could. There was a rough, plaintive note in his voice that Hanyu had never heard before Antony's much longer story the other day, but which he now recognized as frustrated helplessness. All the enemies had to do was stay at a safe distance and shoot me full of arrows. Antony sounded disgusted, and Hanyu had an unhappy inkling that ire was self-directed. I put up a blocking spell, but I was so weak and frightened that it only slowed the bolts down so they didn't pierce as deeply. If the others hadn't arrived just then, I don't think it would have taken them more than 1, maybe 2 minutes to polish us both off. Hanyu couldn't help squeezing Antony tighter to his chest, though of course the danger had passed unfathomably long ago. Oof, the god complained, without any real heat. Hanyu didn't relax his hold. I'm so glad they found you! I doubt it was difficult for them, given all the racket I'd made, his master sighed. If I'd just done as Claudia said, we could have slipped in and out together without all that chaos. But she was kind enough not to say as much. She, Felix, and Titus came flying over that wall and made short work of the consort's hirelings, while Theo and Julia carted our sorry asses away to put us back together. Was Lord Julia already a healer? Hanyu asked. Antony nodded. Yes, much to the irritation of her parents, but she'd stopped speaking to them after they were assholes to Thad and Cloelia, who they didn't think were worthy of the son of one of the oldest holdings in the land. They should have been proud of her skill. By all rights, I should have been dead and Valerius should have lost a leg, but she had us dancing at our wedding. I think she misses magic more than any of the rest of us. She wouldn't be able to rework that particular miracle anymore. You have amazing friends! Hanyu couldn't repress a wondering sigh. Valerius must have been so happy. 6 people all rushing to his rescue, defying a consort on his behalf, risking their lives. Antony huffed out something between a sigh and a laugh. He was pissed at me for getting turned into a pincushion. Still agreed to marry me, though, so I guess he forgave me in the end. Falling in love seems awfully dangerous for you. Hanyu was only half joking. You get shot and stabbed and dissected. He'd hoped for another laugh, but instead, Antony went so still in his arms that he even stopped breathing. Hanyu flinched. He should have known that subject was too painful for jokes. At least I didn't get turned into some damn tree, the god said at last, prompting Hanyu to relax so suddenly that it felt like he might melt into the mattress. I might, if I don't get some sleep, though. Good night, Hanyu. Good night, Hanyu whispered back. He hated storms, he decided. They were the worst thing about living on this ship, but he could handle them, as long as he got to fall asleep afterwards with Antony in his arms.